as if he were mowing the lawn. When they had covered all the land up to the entrance to Quill, Mr. Today, barely holding on to the weighty spell, whispered, "Quilletary, take a dive," and snapped his fingers. Immediately, and as one body, the remaining mobile Quilletary stopped fighting, turned, and marched their way to the seashore. The Artemians, who had a moment ago been fighting, now caught their breath and watched in surprise as the Quilletary stopped and stood in the shallow water. Cimber flew over them. "Freeze!" Mr. Today said. The water at the shore froze, trapping all the Quilletary in place, making them furious, but oddly cooling off some of the hotheads nicely. The people and creatures of Arteme looked up at their leader and broke into applause. "All right, Cimber, take me to Claire, and then stay alert. Watch for my signal." Lanny gasped and clapped her hand to her mouth as the great gray wolf stumbled off. She was confused. "Father?" she whispered, but he was already gone. She had seen the wolf before from a distance, and thought it odd that such a wild creature would have bounded out of the mansion the previous day, only to disappear again shortly thereafter. And then it all began to make sense. "Oh, Father, what have I done? What have you done?" Gingerly she picked up the gun, feeling its weight in her hand, remembering when she was 10, and her father had let her hold it, had even taken her to the Quilletary Range on Purge Day when she was 11, to teach her how to carry it safely, and to let her shoot it when no one else was around. He had made her promise not to tell anyone. That was one secret she'd kept, because it seemed too sacred a moment to work into one of her wild stories. But to her now, the gun represented awful things. She disarmed the gun and slid it into her vest, realizing that despite her knowledge of its workings and all her father had taught her, perhaps even in preparation for this day, she could never ever use it. She snuck off through the trees, growing wearier and hungrier as the evening slipped into night, and suddenly wondered what had happened to Alex, for it had been hours since she'd last seen him. She stopped short. She thought, wondering if she could manage to do one of Alex's favorite spells. She withdrew a paintbrush from her pocket, whispered, "Invisible," and brushed herself up and down with it. The last thing to disappear was the gleam in her eye. Back at the mansion, the injured Samid had too much time to think about how his actions, as Will's assistance, had contributed to the battle raging, and seeing his father again, once his hero, so willing to kill his own son. How could Samid have ever wanted to go back there? Be a part of that? Now, with the guilt overcame him, and he could lie still no longer with his battle raging around him. He struggled to his feet, slipped his component vest on, and when the caretakers weren't looking, he limped outside. As the entire remaining Quilletary marched into the sea, a drenched, bedraggled body finally hoisted himself up to his feet on the beach. He coughed and spit seawater and began wiping the sand from his face and clothes. In the dark, he located the looming mansion and stole quietly in that direction, limping and squishing slightly. He stepped over bodies until he found one wearing a vest like Alex's. Aaron disrobed the fallen Artemian and slipped the vest over his own shoulders, feeling for the one magical item he actually knew how to use. He found a treasure of them and took one, rubbing it in between his fingers, his eyes darting wildly now, looking for prey. I'll earn my position back. I must prove myself to the high priest. I'll find the old man, and I will kill him, and then I'll finish off Alex once and for all. At the corner of the mansion, Aaron stood deep in the shadows. He saw her, the great high priest, the one he would do anything for in order to regain her favor. He knew that now he must be Alex, act like Alex. They must not suspect. He only hoped that no one had yet heard what had really happened to his twin. As he watched Mr. Today approach, he looked around at the bizarre assortment of creatures. Alex, someone whispered. Aaron jumped and turned sharply, coming face to face with a sharp-toothed alligator that had several spindly arms. He nearly screamed in fright. Alex, Miss Octavia whispered again. Be ready with your scatter clips. The lethal verbal component is die 1,000 deaths. If Justine makes any false moves, do your worst, my boy. She'll have to die if any of this is to be resolved. Are you comfortable with that? Aaron blinked, sucked in a breath, and nodded. He didn't understand half of what the creature was saying, but it was enough to know that he had accidentally stumbled upon the verbal component to the spell, which was also the mantra of the Quilletary. He held the clip, poised, appearing ready to throw it in the direction of Justine. But his eyes burned into the back of the head of Mr. Today, who stood only slightly to the side of the high priest. Samid, seeing the high priest, crept forward behind the octogator and Alex, realizing the severity of the scene before him. Justine and Mr. Today about to be face to face once again. He remained quiet, pulling a throwing star from his vest in case it was needed. If only he could take down Justine, it would prove to everyone that he was not a traitor. Miss Octavia readied herself as well, and then glanced more carefully at the boy beside her. She frowned. Something didn't seem right. Samid noticed her glance, and he took another look at Alex, at the way he stood, and at his hand that held the scatter clip. Samid's eyes narrowed and then flashed with fire. He and Will Blair had been studying Alex for months. He knew what was wrong. This boy held the scatter clip in his right hand. It's not Alex, Samid whispered. Aaron's eyes widened in surprise. He tried to run, but Samid muttered, break a leg, which made Aaron squeal in pain and hop on one foot. In one swift motion, 4 of Miss Octavia's remaining 7 appendages threaded and twisted over and under the boy's arms and around his legs, rendering his struggles useless and forcing his good leg to buckle. He dropped to the ground. Silence, she said in a low voice. Aaron's cry dried in his throat. He shook violently, helplessly. Well done, Samid, Miss Octavia said. Don't move another inch, Aaron Stowe, or you're a dead man. She growled into his ear and chomped her teeth together to keep from biting his head completely off. Way to go, Samid. If I did something right. Hello again, Mr. Today said coldly as he approached the high priest's vehicle. All around him were piles of wounded, sleeping, or splatter-painted Quilitary. On the road beyond the high priest, a pileup of smoking vehicles groaned in various stages of death. The rest of Artemis' walking wounded, suddenly bereft of their enemies, picked their way around the bodies and fell in behind their leader, ready to carry on if necessary, for as long as they could stand and draw breath. "Oh, Marcus, my dear," came the sarcastic reply. "I've been waiting for you." "Oh, how terribly polite." "Indeed," she said. The high priest Justine sat on the seat of her vehicle, with Claire Morning tucked securely under one arm, a pistol pointed at Claire's temple. Governor Strang sat behind her, his pistol trained on Megan Ranger, who lay on the corner of the mansion roof nearest them. 4 more governors stood at the entrance with their pistols pointed randomly at anyone who dared move. Only Senior Governor Haluki was missing. "Your young protege Aaron sends his regards." "Shame that you should punish him. He's the only one who might have saved you all," Mr. Today said evenly. Justine's eyes narrowed. "Oh, come now, Justine, why so suspicious? Have you forgotten our little secret passage to the palace?" he asked. "And, oh dear, let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Good heavens! You're missing a governor. Pity." The 4 standing governors wavered, casting sidelong glances at another in the starlight. "Dear me, and have you told your governors about your secret gift? You know," he whispered loudly, "magic?" "Enough!" shouted Justine. "You do not deny it." "Silence, you traitor!" Marcus Today smiled a small smile. "Justine, honestly, have you no secrets on me that you can reveal to my people so that they might gaze at me suspiciously as your governors are now looking at you? Surely there must be something." Justine glared at Mr. Today. She cocked the hammer of the pistol that grazed Claire's temple. Claire closed her eyes reflexively and then opened them again, granting permission to her father to do whatever it took. "What have you done with Aaron?" Justine growled. Oh, the twin? Well, there was a bit of a skirmish at the palace, you see. You know how it is with twins." He chuckled loudly. "Best of friends, worst of enemies, all that rot. I imagine he's around here somewhere. Pity he isn't coming to your aid." Justine snarled and looked at Claire, judging her features. "All these years, Marcus, 30 of the last 50 years, you've spent betraying me and all I've stood for, all we've stood for, and after all I've done for you and for Quill, how could you?" Mr. Today sighed and looked up at the sky, shook his head slowly, and then looked back at the high priest. "The question is, dear sister, how could you?" Justine's face burned. She stood up in the vehicle and wrenched Claire to her feet. "Say goodbye to your daughter, once and for all," she spat. Mr. Today nodded amicably at the high priest and smiled warmly at Claire. "Goodbye, daughter," he said. From the sky, a whirlwind. Simber swooped in with his powerful wings, knocking the 4 governors across the road and the 5th headfirst into the back seat. He grabbed Claire in his jaws and sailed away. When the shots rang out in the confusion, it was the high priest Justine who slumped over in her seat and began to deflate like a balloon until she was nothing but a flat rubber body that flopped over and fell to the floor, only to be stepped on in the aftermath. Clearly, no bullet had done that to her. No one could see the invisible Lanny, nor could they hear her whisper, evermore, nevermore, an irrevocable spell that she had delighted in finding in her studies. All this was the perfect use for it. Justine would forevermore be silent and useless. Take that, you old windbag, she muttered when she saw it had worked perfectly. Afterward, Lanny ran as fast as she could toward the part of the shore that remained unfrozen. She took the gun from her vest and flung it as far as she could into the sea. And then, finally, she slipped away to the forest to find her father. I would love to hear your reactions and comments about what you've read this week. So please, if there's somewhere we can have you do it, whether I do it on Ink or if you just want to send me a message, share it with me on Google Drive. There's a huge chapter